The French spy gave US this before he died. Security Minister General Ibrahim Ouedraogo rushed into the room carrying a blood-stained briefcase. Agent Pierre Dubois handed these documents to us before his last breath. When Traoré opened the briefcase, hundreds of classified documents spilled out. General, what do these documents prove?
Mr.
President, Ouedraogo said with a trembling voice, Africa's last 100 years were completely planned. Every coup, every war, every famine. It's all written in these files. July 23, 2024, 2:45 a.m. A state of emergency had been declared in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Following armed clashes in the city's outer districts, the body of a French agent had been discovered. However, this was not just an ordinary intelligence operation. This incident would expose the biggest secret in African history. Ibrahim Traoré was conducting an emergency meeting in the secure room of the presidential palace that night. For the past 2 weeks, there had been suspicious activities around Burkina Faso. French intelligence services had increased their operations, and several civilian observers had mysteriously disappeared.
Mr.
President, said intelligence coordinator Colonel Ibrahim Traoré, tonight's clash was no coincidence. Agent Pierre Dubois had been assigned to West Africa for 15 years as a DGSE operative. But according to our latest reports, he was having problems with his own service. Traoré looked at the map and asked, Burima, what was a French agent doing on Burkina Faso soil? And why did the clash occur?
Mr.
President, here's the strange part, Dubois was trying to make contact with us. One of our agents reported that he wanted to convey something important to us. At that moment, Security Minister General Ibrahim Ouedraogo burst into the room urgently. He was carrying a blood-stained leather briefcase. His face showed both concern and excitement.
Mr.
President, we have a major development, General Ouedraogo said breathlessly. Agent Pierre Dubois really was trying to contact us. Before he died, he handed this briefcase to our men. Traoré looked at the briefcase. The leather case appeared old, with wear marks on the corners. The bloodstains on it showed what kind of end its last owner had met. General, do you have any information about the contents of these documents?
Mr.
President, we took a preliminary look. These aren't just ordinary intelligence files. These documents show how Africa's last 100 years were planned. Traoré placed the briefcase on the table and opened the lock. Hundreds of documents, photographs, maps, and USB drives spilled out. On the top document, there was a handwritten note, to Ibrahim Traoré, Africa's Truth.
PD.
When he picked up the first document, Traoré's expression changed. The document was titled Operation Eternit, with a subtitle Africa Control, 192420242050. General, what do these documents prove? Traoré asked, his tone becoming more serious. General Ouedraogo replied with a trembling voice, Mr. President, Africa's last 100 years were completely planned. Every coup, every war, every famine. It's all written in these files. Traoré opened the second document. This time he faced a world map where the African continent was divided into colored regions. Each color represented different control, French control, British influence, American interests. What does this map mean?
Traoré asked.
Mr. President, this shows how Africa has been divided since the 1884 Berlin Conference. But what's really surprising is that this division is still continuing. The third document shocked Traoré the most. It was titled Project Sankara Termination Orders. It contained details of how Thomas Sankara was killed, by whose orders and why. General, Traoré said, anger in his voice, these documents reveal whose fingerprints were on Thomas Sankara's assassination.
Yes, Mr. President. And not just Sankara.
There's a list of all African leaders who were killed or overthrown in the last 40 years. Traoré began delving into deeper files. The independence process of every African country post-1960 had been planned in detail. Which leaders would be removed from power, how resources would be controlled, even when famines would occur in which countries were all documented. This is unbelievable, Traoré said. Here it says how Burkina Faso's gold reserves have been exploited since the 1970s. Without us ever knowing. General Ouedraogo said, Mr. President, you haven't seen the most terrifying part yet. We need to open the files on the USB. Traoré inserted the USB into the computer. The first file that appeared on screen was titled Phase 3, 2024 to 2050 Africa Control. This file detailed how Africa would be kept under control until 2050. How resource exploitation would be increased using new technologies, which countries would have artificial famines created, which leaders would be eliminated. General, my name is here too, Traoré said with amazement. For 2025, it says Ibrahim Traoré, termination operation.
Mr.
President, it's not just you. Dembele in Mali, Tiani in Niger. All your names are there. Traoré continued reading the file. The most shocking part was the list of local agents in African countries. Some names were familiar, people serving in government who were thought to be trustworthy. General, there are names from our cabinet in this list. How is this possible?
Mr.
President, apparently the infiltration is much deeper than we thought. Traoré opened another file, CFA Franc Permanent Slavery Project. This file explained the real purpose of the CFA franc system. General, it says here that the CFA franc was never designed for the benefit of African countries. It was established solely as a resource transfer mechanism.
Mr.
President, the documents show that $500 billion are transferred from the CFA zone to France every year. $500 billion. This figure is larger than the total budget of all CFA countries. The fifth file was titled Operation Gladio Africa. It described how coups, civil wars, and terrorist attacks in Africa were organized. General, these documents show that most conflicts in Africa were artificially created.
Yes, Mr. President.
Especially in resource-rich regions, conflicts are created so resources can be easily extracted. The sixth file was titled Media Manipulation Africa. It detailed how news about Africa in Western media was manipulated, which stories were exaggerated, and which were hidden. General, there are plans here about our recent decisions too. How we were planned to be portrayed as dictators in Western media.
Mr.
President, it even says which journalists will do which stories. The seventh file was the most dangerous, biological control project. It explained how some disease outbreaks in Africa were deliberately created. General, if these documents are true, we're talking about a very serious crime.
Mr.
President, I now understand why Agent Dubois shared these documents with us. He was suffering from guilt. Traoré opened the eighth file, Next Generation Control. This file described how Africa would be controlled using artificial intelligence, digital technologies, and social media. General, it says here how they're trying to manipulate our youth. Even social media algorithms are under control.
Mr.
President, the goal is to make young people want to flee Africa. This way, brain drain will continue. The ninth file was African Leaders Control Manual. This file documented how African leaders were controlled, what their motivational sources were, and how they were manipulated. General, here's the psychological profile of every African leader. How they'll be persuaded, how they'll be intimidated.
Mr.
President, the most terrifying part is this: some leaders are aware of these things and voluntarily cooperate. The 10th file was Resource Extraction Timeline 2024 to 2050. Africa's resources had been planned in detail for when and how they would be extracted. General, it says here that Burkina Faso's gold reserves will be depleted by 2030. Then they'll move to uranium.
Mr.
President, not just ours, all of Africa's resources have been mapped. When Traoré opened the 11th file, the sight before him fascinated him: counter-operation plans. This file described how measures would be taken against African countries' independence attempts. General, these documents predicted our recent decisions in advance.
Yes, Mr. President.
There are plans regarding Mali, Niger, and us. The 12th file was African Unity Prevention. It described how the African Union was rendered ineffective and how real unity was prevented. General, it says here how African Union meetings were sabotaged.
Mr.
President, what was done to prevent certain decisions from passing is described in detail. The last file was the most hopeful: Resistance Movements Surveillance. This file listed groups working for real independence in Africa. General, this file is actually a map for us. It shows who we can cooperate with.
Yes, Mr. President.
It appears there are many secret resistance groups. After examining the files for hours, Traoré spoke one last time at 6 a.m. General, these documents don't just explain the past, they also show the future. We cannot allow these plans to continue.
Mr.
President, How will we use these documents? General, these documents will become Africa's liberation plan. We'll send copies to every African leader.
Mr.
President, it's very risky. If they find out these documents have leaked. General, they're already planning to kill us. There's nothing left to fear. Traoré stood up and looked out the window. The sun was rising. General, Agent Dubois gave his life to give us this chance. We'll use these documents for Africa's liberation.
Mr.
President, what will we do first? First, we'll put copies of these documents in safe places. Then we'll present them to all leaders at the African Union Summit in Malta.
Mr.
President, can you imagine what will happen at this summit? General, this summit will be the turning point in African history. The 100-year deception will end. 2 weeks later, the African Union Summit held in Malta became the most turbulent meeting in history. The documents presented by Traoré shocked 54 African leaders. Tanzania President Samia Suluhu Hassan stood up. If these documents are true, we've all been deceived. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, this level of manipulation is unacceptable. Rwandan President Paul Kagame, these documents might be the last chance for Africa's unity. Ghanaian President Akufo-Addo, we cannot allow these plans to continue. At the end of the summit, 54 countries signed a joint declaration, Africa Liberation Declaration. With this declaration, all natural resources would be nationalized. Dependence on foreign currencies would end. Intra-African trade would be prioritized. Complete independence in education and technology would be achieved. 6 months later, while Western media ran stories with headlines like "Chaos in Africa," African economies experienced historic growth. 1 year later, Ibrahim Traoré spoke at the UN General Assembly. 1 year ago, thanks to documents given by a martyred French agent, we learned about a 100-year deception. Today, Africa has achieved true independence. Agent Pierre Dubois listened to his conscience in his final breath. Africa's liberation began with his sacrifice. These documents are now preserved in the African archives. Every African citizen can read these documents. And every July 23rd is celebrated as African Truth Day. Pierre Dubois's courage disrupted 100-year plans. Africa now writes its own destiny. But the story of how these documents came to light requires deeper examination. Agent Pierre Dubois wasn't just any French operative. Born in Lyon in 1975, he had been recruited by the DGSE, Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, fresh out of university, where he had studied African history and economics. His academic background made him the perfect candidate for long-term assignment in West Africa. For 15 years, Dubois had operated across the Sahel region, officially serving as a trade attaché in various French embassies. His real job, however, was maintaining France's network of influence across former colonies. He spoke fluent Bambara, Moor and Hausa, allowing him to blend seamlessly into local communities and gather intelligence that formal diplomatic channels couldn't access. The transformation in Dubois began in 2019, during what the documents later revealed as Operation Barkhane Extension. He had been tasked with identifying and neutralizing potential threats to French mining interests in Burkina Faso. This meant creating detailed profiles of local leaders who showed signs of nationalist tendencies. Ibrahim Traoré had been on that list. As Dubois compiled his reports on Traoré, documenting the young officer's growing popularity among junior military personnel and his criticism of foreign military presence, something unexpected happened. The more he learned about Traoré's background, his education, his genuine concern for rural development, his refusal to engage in the corruption that plagued many African militaries, the more Dubois began questioning his own mission. The breaking point came in late 2022, when Dubois was ordered to facilitate what his superiors euphemistically called political transition assistance in Burkina Faso. In practical terms, this meant identifying military officers who could be recruited to oppose Traoré's rising influence. The operation bore uncomfortable similarities to previous interventions that had destabilized African countries for decades. Dubois had witnessed the aftermath of such operations throughout his career. In Mali, he had seen how the 2012 intervention had created a security vacuum that required permanent French military presence. In Ivory Coast, he had observed how the 2010 to 2011 crisis had been prolonged by competing foreign interests. Each time, the official narrative spoke of democracy and stability, while the classified reports focused on resource access and strategic positioning. The internal documents that Dubois eventually leaked revealed the true scope of what the files called Francafrique 2.0, a modernized version of France's traditional sphere of influence in Africa. Unlike the crude colonialism of earlier eras, this system operated through sophisticated networks of economic dependency, political manipulation, and cultural influence. The financial mechanisms were particularly ingenious. Through the CFA franc system, African countries were required to deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury. This money was then loaned back to these same countries at market interest rates. Effectively, African nations were paying France to hold their own money, while France invested these deposits in global markets and kept the profits. But the economic control went far beyond currency manipulation. The documents revealed a comprehensive system of what economists euphemistically called transfer pricing optimization. African countries would sell raw materials to French companies at artificially low prices. These same materials would then be processed in France and sold back to African countries at market rates, capturing the value-added portion of the supply chain for French industry. The mining sector was particularly exploitative. Uranium from Niger-powered French nuclear plants, providing cheap electricity that gave French industry a competitive advantage globally. Gold from Mali and Burkina Faso was sold through French banks at prices determined by French commodity traders. Cocoa from Ivory Coast was processed by French chocolate manufacturers, who captured 90% of the final product's value while paying farmers subsistence wages. The political control mechanisms were equally sophisticated. The documents detailed a system called democratic guidance, whereby French advisors would identify promising young African politicians early in their careers. These individuals would receive scholarships to French universities, internships with French companies, and eventually funding for their political campaigns. By the time they reached positions of power, they were deeply embedded in Franco-African networks that shaped their decision-making. For those leaders who proved resistant to this soft influence, harder measures were available. The files contained detailed psychological profiles of every major African leader, identifying their weaknesses, fears, and pressure points. Some could be controlled through financial incentives. Others responded to threats against their families. A few required more dramatic interventions. The assassination of Thomas Sankara was documented in clinical detail. Sankara's crime had been his vision of genuine African independence, his plans to exit the CFA franc system, his programs for food self-sufficiency, his rejection of French military bases. The operation that eliminated him had been planned for months, with French intelligence working through Burkina Faso's military to identify officers willing to participate in a coup. Similar documentation existed for other African leaders who had challenged the system. Patrice Lumumba's assassination in Congo, which had long been suspected of foreign involvement, was confirmed with financial records showing payments to his killers. More recent interventions in Libya, Ivory Coast, and Mali were revealed as part of a coordinated strategy to prevent the emergence of truly independent African states. The military dimension of French control was perhaps the most visible but least understood aspect of the system. France maintained permanent military bases across Africa, officially to provide security assistance to friendly governments. The classified documents revealed the base's real purpose, ensuring rapid response capability to protect French economic interests. French military interventions in Africa weren't humanitarian missions or anti-terrorism operations, despite public messaging. They were colonial policing actions designed to maintain the political and economic arrangements that benefited France. The troops weren't there to protect African civilians, they were there to protect French investments. The cultural and educational dimensions of control were subtler but equally effective. French language policies in African schools ensured that educated Africans could easily integrate into French-dominated institutions while struggling to communicate with peers in neighboring countries that used different colonial languages. African students studying in France were exposed to curricula that portrayed French involvement in Africa as benevolent partnership rather than exploitative relationship. French media companies operating in Africa shaped public discourse by emphasizing tribal conflicts, corruption, and instability while downplaying systematic economic exploitation by foreign powers. African journalists working for these outlets were trained to report news in ways that reinforced narratives of African incompetence and French indispensability. The technological dimension of control was rapidly expanding. The documents revealed plans to use social media algorithms to promote content that encouraged brain drain from Africa to Europe. Young Africans would be systematically exposed to imagery and messaging that portrayed success as leaving Africa for Western countries, ensuring continued outflow of educated workers. Digital payment systems were being designed to maintain financial control even as physical currencies evolved. African countries moving away from CFA franc would find themselves dependent on French-controlled digital platforms for international transactions. The same dependency would exist, hidden behind modern technology. The documents also revealed the scale of resistance that French intelligence was monitoring. Across Africa, thousands of individuals and organizations were working for genuine independence. Some were political leaders like Traoré, others were intellectuals, business leaders, civil society activists. Many were ordinary citizens who simply refused to accept that poverty and dependency were Africa's natural condition. These resistance movements had been systematically infiltrated, monitored, and when necessary, disrupted. The methods ranged from simple surveillance to sophisticated disinformation campaigns to targeted assassinations. The goal was never to eliminate all resistance, that would be impossible and counterproductive, but to prevent the emergence of coordinated continental movements that could challenge the system comprehensively. The leak of these documents represented a catastrophic intelligence failure for France. For the first time, African leaders had documentary proof of what many had long suspected. The evidence was detailed enough to be verified, comprehensive enough to reveal the full scope of the system, and recent enough to be immediately actionable. More importantly, the documents provided a roadmap for resistance. By understanding exactly how the control mechanisms worked, African leaders could develop targeted counter-strategies. Instead of attacking the symptoms of dependency, they could strike at the root causes. The immediate aftermath of the document leak was chaotic. French intelligence services went into crisis mode, trying to determine how much sensitive information had been compromised. Emergency meetings were held in Paris to develop response strategies. Some officials advocated for military intervention to retrieve the documents and eliminate those who had seen them. Others argued for a political solution that would discredit the documents or minimize their impact. Meanwhile, across Africa, the documents circulated rapidly despite attempts to suppress them. African intelligence services, many of which had been infiltrated by French operatives, found themselves in the awkward position of trying to hide information that exposed their own collaboration with foreign powers. Some officials chose loyalty to their own countries over loyalty to foreign handlers. Others doubled down on their collaboration, hoping that France would protect them from domestic consequences. The continental response emerged gradually as African leaders absorbed the implications of what they had learned. Initial reactions ranged from denial to outrage to fear. Some leaders who discovered their own names in assassination lists immediately increased their security. Others who found evidence of their officials' collaboration began internal purges. But gradually, a consensus emerged. The system revealed in the documents was too comprehensive and too exploitative to be reformed. It had to be dismantled entirely. This realization led to the formation of what historians would later call the Continental Liberation Coalition, an unprecedented alliance of African countries committed to genuine independence. The economic aspects of liberation proved surprisingly manageable once political will existed. Africa's natural resources provided more than enough wealth to fund development. The problem had always been that this wealth was being extracted by foreign powers. By nationalizing resource extraction and establishing direct trade relationships with countries outside the traditional colonial sphere, African countries could retain the value their resources created. The financial independence proved more complex but equally achievable. Creating new currency systems backed by Africa's vast gold reserves provided an alternative to both the CFA franc and dependence on the US dollar. Digital currencies enabled direct trade between African countries without requiring conversion through European or American banks. The security challenges were significant but not insurmountable. France's military bases in Africa had always been more about psychological intimidation than actual defensive capability. African countries working together could provide their own security, especially with technology transfers from countries like China and Russia that had their own interests in reducing Western dominance in Africa. Perhaps most importantly, the leak provided African populations with a clear understanding of why their countries remained poor despite abundant natural resources. This knowledge created unprecedented unity across ethnic, religious, and national boundaries. Africans finally understood that their common enemy was not each other, but the external systems that kept all of them impoverished. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took months of careful planning, years of gradual implementation, and constant vigilance against sabotage and retaliation. But the documents had provided something that resistance movements had always lacked: a complete understanding of what they were fighting against. 5 years after Agent Dubois made his final, redemptive choice, Africa had become a fundamentally different continent. Resource wealth was being invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure rather than being exported to enrich foreign countries. Young Africans were staying home to build their own societies rather than fleeing to Europe. African countries were trading with each other rather than being confined to colonial trade patterns. The files that Agent Pierre Dubois died to deliver had indeed changed everything. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. Africans finally understood that their poverty had never been natural or inevitable. It had been artificial and imposed. Once that understanding spread, the political and economic changes became not just possible but inevitable. The colonial era was finally truly over. Africa's real independence had begun.